Welcome to The Scoop from the Lurie Cancer Center's Adolescent and Young Adult, or AYA Cancer Program. We bring together AYA cancer survivors and experts to answer important AYA cancer-related questions. We hope you enjoy the conversation today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Scoop today. Thank you so much for being with us. Today, we are going to talk all about cancer and work. And so we are going to get started with a few introductions. I am Bryn Fowler. I am the Adolescent and Young Adult Oncology Program Coordinator at both Lurie Children's Hospital and at Northwestern. Monica, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. My name is Monica. I'm a 4-year non-Hodgkin's lymphoma survivor. I received my care at Northwestern Medicine, and I'm excited to be here. I actually used Cancer and Careers, the resume coach and service for the job I have now. So thank you.
Love it. And Rachel?
Excellent. And so my name is Rachel Becker. I am Senior Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I'm also an oncology social worker.
Great. Well, I really appreciate both of you being with us today and bringing your experience and expertise to the table. So Rachel, we have a few questions for you today, and we hope that the folks listening find this conversation helpful. So I thought it would be good to maybe start with talking about things that happen for folks who are in the workplace. So Rachel, something that we hear a lot about is kind of this under this concept of disclosure and what to tell and what not to tell your workplace about your health status and just how to navigate that. So could you maybe speak a little bit to that and talk about what approaches are most appropriate and effective?
Yeah, so the decision about whether or not to disclose and what to disclose is really personal, and it's going to vary from person to person. Based on who that person is, based on what their workplace is. And I think it's important to start off by noting that broadly speaking, there's no requirement to disclose any information about your health history to a current employer or to a prospective employer. There are some exceptions, so it's not a perfectly hard and fast rule, but broadly speaking, there's no requirement. So it is the first question is, do I want to share? Is this important to share? So when thinking through that, there are a number of considerations. So the first thing to think about is whether treatment is going to impact the ability to do your job, right? So this is something you want to talk to the healthcare team about. For example, if you know that you're going to have a chemotherapy protocol and your team is telling you that that is likely to make you start feeling fatigued, is that going to impact how you do your job? Is that the kind of thing that your employer is going to notice that, maybe you're taking more time off or you're not getting things done as quickly? Is that going to cause them to start asking questions? And if you think that might be the case, maybe you would want to disclose to fill in the blanks so that they understand what's going on, right? So the second consideration is whether there are any legal benefits that might come from sharing. So any protections that you might be able to access. For example, protection from discrimination. If you are concerned that your employer might treat you differently because you have a diagnosis, if there's maybe a history of that in your workplace that you're aware of, there could be a benefit to letting them know that you have been diagnosed and this is something that you're going through in order to kind of head that off at the pass. And then personal identity also factors in here when thinking about whether or not you might want to disclose. And for some people, they're just sharers. And it's going to feel really unnatural to hold back something that feels so big from the people that they work with every day. Sometimes we see our coworkers more than we see our families. In some environments, our coworkers feel like a second family. And so not making known what's going on can be kind of uncomfortable for some people. On the other side of the equation, there are people who are not sharers. They like to leave their personal lives separate from their work. There are some people who maybe feel specifically that way about their medical information, that, their family, their grandkids, that's fine. They'll talk about that. But talking about their medical details at work, off the table. So knowing how that factors in for you, knowing what your personal choice is, your personal feelings about it, in fact, is something you should think about when deciding whether or not to share. And then if you do decide to share, it could factor into how you want to share and what you want to share. Because remember also that sharing, disclosing, it's not an all or nothing situation. You know, if you decide that there's some information that you need to make public, it doesn't have to be every last detail. It can be just the pieces that are relevant. You know, someone could make the choice to say, hey, I need to have a medical procedure done, and so I need time off for that surgery. And that's, you know, why I'm taking time off. And that could be all they share. Never name the diagnosis, never name what the procedure is. And that's okay, because we can always share more later. But once something's out there, you can't unshare it. So important to think about that too, the way in which the information gets disclosed. And then it's important before having any disclosure conversations in the workplace to spend some time planning them out. Think about the points that you want to make. It's really understandable that people get nervous before they have these conversations. And so it can be beneficial to have a script where you kind of planned out the points that you want to hit, the things that you want to cover, to make sure that you don't miss anything. And one point that you should always work into these conversations is reminding your employer or teaching your employer, because not every employer knows a lot about cancer or anything about cancer possibly. But we're letting them know that the cancer experience is a fluid one, that what we know today is what we know today. And it could be different 4 weeks from now. It could be different 6 weeks or 6 months from now. And so your plan is to have an ongoing conversation, you know, that you want to work with them to think through how you're going to make things work, whether that means working full-time through treatment, part-time through treatment, taking time off in whatever fashion. You're dedicated to finding a solution that's going to work for both of you, and you're dedicated to continuing the conversation so that you're addressing the needs as they evolve. Because one thing that it can be very uncomfortable is making a lot of promises right up front and then finding yourself having to dial them back later because something came up that you weren't anticipating.
Yeah. Those are all such helpful considerations. I appreciate you sharing those.
Absolutely. It's such an important conversation, disclosure piece of it.
Thank you for that. And I remember being in treatment, and there were side effects ranging from A to Z. What suggestions might you have regarding how to manage these side effects at work? I know it's common to hear things like you may not be able to work, you know, at the same pace as before, or just it's just a new normal. Whether it's about focus, stamina, what might you advise?
Yeah. So the first piece of advice, I think, is really just to be gentle with yourself when these changes happen, and to be patient and to recognize that it's not always going to be this way. You know, if you are going through treatment and you are experiencing fatigue because of your treatment or trouble focusing, once treatment is over, it's likely to start shifting back. Is it going to shift all the way back to what it was before? We don't know. But if you're in treatment and you're experiencing side effects, they're not likely going to be forever. So be gentle, be patient, and be graceful with yourself around that. We get asked a lot about focus. People really struggle with focus. It's probably the most common side effect that we get asked about. And when it comes to managing issues focusing on the job, there's really no magic bullet solution, unfortunately. It's all about going back to basics and taking things one step at a time. And I think probably the most important piece of guidance here is to just let go of the idea that multitasking is something that you're going to be able to pull off successfully. And this is actually a great piece of advice for pretty much anyone, regardless of what they're going through in terms of their health, because while we live in a society where there are these constant distractions and we all like to think that we can multitask and we can respond to text messages and be focused on this project for work and be managing the kids who are still, you know, at home or what have you while we're working from home. The fact is that the human brain is really designed to work best when it's focusing on one thing at a time. So turn off that cell phone, put it upside down so you can't see the screen. Turn off email notifications if that's going to be helpful. You know, if you work in a kind of office environment where there's a shared calendar, it can be really helpful to schedule appointments for yourself on that calendar. where you're going to be focusing on a specific project. And then to tell your team that between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m., you're going to be heads down, working on this thing, not responding to email, not responding to instant messages, but you will be back on at 3. And that can take off a lot of the pressure of feeling like you have to jump and respond when your boss reaches out. Right? Writing things down can be helpful. And when I say this, I mean literally taking a pen in your hand, having a piece of paper, and writing it down with a pen. There have been some studies done that show that you actually process information and you tend to remember it better when you use a pen and a paper to write something down than you do when you type it. And we recommend having a single notebook that goes with you everywhere. So you don't find yourself in a meeting and instead of presentation notes, you have your grocery list, right? It's all in the same place. All the notes that you're making for all of your life are in the same place. And so you know that they're with you. Preparing for conversations are important, writing down scripts for those meetings or for phone calls that you might be having. And really, taking the time, being patient with yourself if you need to practice saying those things out loud as well. Sometimes just before you get on a phone call, maybe it's a project update with your boss, before you get on that phone call to just say out loud what you want to say. So you just run those words through your mouth and you're not saying them for the first time when you're on the call. And a final piece of the equation, which I think is really key to remember, is that stress can impact your ability to focus. And again, this is a human thing. This is true for people regardless of health history, regardless of age, regardless of educational background. When we get anxious, when we get stressed out, it can be difficult to focus. So building breaks into your day can help not just with managing any fatigue that you might be having, but also with focus. And they don't necessarily have to be long breaks. If you can bake in some long breaks, or if you have scheduled breaks as part of your job, that's great. But even taking 2 minutes to, watch a YouTube video of ocean waves, or listen to a song that you love, or breathe in some essential oils that help you unstress. These just little tweaks can help hit the reset button. They can help you continue to focus. And Monica, of course, you mentioned side effects can range from A to Z. There are so many physical side effects can extend well beyond the focus issues and the fatigue issues that we just discussed. So talking with your healthcare team about their suggestions for what might increase your comfort is really important. And then thinking about how you can marry those solutions up with the job that you're doing, with the work that you're doing.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I love the practicality of what you're talking about. Rachel, you talked a little bit about this in our discussion earlier, but can you speak a little bit more specifically to kind of what's available to people through legal rights or accommodations in the workplace? I think sometimes we don't even know that those things are available to us, and it's helpful to know that they are there and you can take advantage of them.
Absolutely. It's such a good point that you make, that so many people don't know that the protections are available. And generally, I think it can also just be really scary to think about the law in the context of your job. People don't want to mix those two things together, and that can be a little intimidating. But the fact is that there's one key law in particular, the Americans with Disabilities Act, we'll spend some time talking about, which is really a tool. And for many people, it is the key tool that helps them figure out how exactly they're going to continue working during all or part of treatment. And I'm not an attorney. I want to say that up front. I mentioned that I'm a social worker. I know about this law, but I am not a legal expert. And so if anyone who's listening has questions about whether or not they qualify for protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because not everyone does, I definitely recommend reaching out to a legal expert for more information. You can reach out to Cancer and Careers. We can help you find one if that's something that you're looking for. But to give you an overview of the law for the purposes of today's conversation, people who qualify for the ADA are entitled to protection from discrimination in the workplace, we talked a little bit about earlier, and also to reasonable accommodation. And what those are It's a pretty big category, but to summarize it, a reasonable accommodation is a change to where, how, when you do your job that allows you to continue doing it along with any side effects that you may be having. So what does that look like? Well, for somebody who's having trouble, kind of navigating new energy levels that they're experiencing, let's say they've noticed that they wake up in the morning and they're feeling really sharp and they're really productive, but then come the afternoon, they're starting to drop off in those last couple of hours in their 9 to 5 day, not so productive. They might request an accommodation of shifting their schedule from 9 to 5 to 7 to 3, right? So it's the same number of hours, but they're maximizing the hours where they feel they're most productive. That's one example of an accommodation. Another might be a change to a physical space, like a chair that's more comfortable. If somebody started experiencing back pain, or an ergonomic keyboard or an ergonomic mouse for somebody who's experiencing neuropathy in their hands, these kinds of equipment changes could be considered a reasonable accommodation. And I think it's also important to point out here that even if you don't have access to reasonable accommodations under the ADA, you can still ask your employer for an accommodation. A lot of times, employers are happy to do these things to keep their valuable employees just because it's the right thing to do. They don't need a law to tell them that if somebody's having issues using their keyboard, the good thing to do is get them a keyboard that's easier to use, right? So even if you talk to an attorney who says, no, you don't apply, you don't qualify under the ADA, always ask. Still a good idea to ask. And what I will also point out, final note on this, is that each state has their own fair employment laws as well. Sometimes those laws can be more protective than the ADA, or they can expand the protections that are provided by the ADA. So if you are looking into getting information, whether you're looking online or talking to a legal expert, make sure you're also asking about your state fair employment laws.
Super helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And I loved how earlier you mentioned, when determining whether or not to disclose or just share, that some people might be more prone to just be sharers and others might be a little bit more private, or maybe you're okay sharing one day. You kind of maybe, got an update from your oncologist and you're kind of thrown off and you're like, well, I don't really want to share today. What advice do you have? What suggestions do you have on how to kind of handle boundaries and just kind of some of those trickier comments that might be made? Most of the time, of course, well-intentioned, but maybe not something you want to talk about, or just kind of make sure that you feel comfortable with what you do end up sharing.
Absolutely. I love that question, Monica. It's such an important one. I think, in particular, when people are in treatment and their own energy limitations and accessible pool of inner resources become a moving target, right? And it does shift from day to day. Maybe it's the way your treatment hit you. Maybe it's the news that you got that was emotionally draining or what have you. And so it's up to us to protect those boundaries in the workplace. And we have every right to do that when it comes to talking about our personal lives and our personal information. And there's a verbal technique that we recommend at Cancer and Careers that we call the swivel. So if a coworker, if your employer comes to you with one of those well-intended questions that you mentioned that maybe you don't feel like answering, this technique can feel very helpful. So an example of a kind of question that we hear a lot about is, somebody might be asked, how are you feeling today? Right? And that can sound like an innocuous question. We ask these kinds of general, broad questions all the time, but often it's accompanied by that head tilt and that kind of look where, how are you feeling today? And that they're asking for a cancer update. They're not just pleasantly greeting you. And so the way that one might swivel out of that would be to say, Doing all right. And while I have you standing here, I actually am glad that you've shown up, because I'd like to ask you a question about the new time card system that was put in place. I can't seem to get it to work. Can you go over it with me? Right. So essentially what we've done there is we've acknowledged the comment that was made. We've put a nice and in there and then swiveled it around to an area where you feel more comfortable talking. Right. And that person in particular drove towards something that was work related. Another example might be a coworker who comes up to you and says, oh, my uncle had that same kind of cancer, right? And they're trying to connect with you. They think they're doing a nice thing, but if you don't want to talk about it, you can say, wow, that must have been really challenging. And while I have you here, I have a question for you about the meeting that we had the other day. You mentioned X, Y, and Z thing. Can you tell me more about that? And again, you're letting that person subtly know that we're going to talk about something else today. We're going to talk about work. People tend to pick up the conversations from where things got left off. So they'll probably take the hint. And that's a way that you can really feel a little bit more in control in those moments.
I like that, the swivel. Thank you.
Swivel. It's a good one. Useful in all sorts of circumstances.
I know. I'm thinking of other ways I can use the swivel. Let's transition a little bit in our conversation now to thinking about folks who may be looking for employment. So how would you suggest people navigate things like explaining gaps in employment maybe due to your cancer treatment with their potential employer, or just kind of as part of that, going back to what we were talking about earlier with disclosure of do you have to divulge that health information with those gaps?
Yeah, so this is, again, such an important question, one that we get asked all the time. And I think the first thing that I'll say is gaps on resumes are a lot more common and have been a lot more common in the past few years than they used to be at a certain point in time. And so, this is a young adult audience, so you might not all remember as far back as I do as to when a gap on a resume was really a flashing neon sign that employers were drawn to. But really, since 2008, when we saw the economic downturn that happened then, and all people lost their jobs for all sorts of reasons that weren't their fault, many hiring managers stopped asking about that and started focusing more on asking questions that would really help them to figure out if that person was the best candidate for the job. So it's entirely possible that you won't be asked. And of course, now also with everything that's been going on with COVID and the changes in the job market, we're seeing gaps on resumes for all sorts of reasons. So you may not get asked at all. Number one. However, absolutely possible that you will get asked, and you want to be prepared if that happens. And so this is, again, a moment where the swivel can come in really handy. And what I will remind everyone here is, again, as we discussed earlier, broadly speaking, there is no reason to disclose to a potential employer anything about your health history, right? So don't feel like there's an obligation to do it. And it's not lying if you don't. Okay, so this is something that we hear a lot from people. They say, well, but the truth is that I stopped working because of my cancer treatment. So isn't it a lie? Well, we're more than our job and we're more than our diagnosis. We're people who have a whole variety of experiences in our lives. And so, it may be true that, you didn't really love the job that you were at anyway. And while you took time off, you started taking courses so you could pivot into another job, so you might swivel by saying, I decided that I wanted to take a step back and reevaluate what I was doing. I was in a position where I could do it. And I decided that I really wanted to focus on X, Y, and Z instead. And so I took a couple of online classes. Let me tell you how I think I can apply that in this role, right? Also, perfectly valid to swivel away by saying, there was a family issue that's now resolved that I needed to attend to, but everything's set on that front. I'm really excited to return to the workforce. And I was drawn to this position specifically because it will allow me to exercise blah, 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 blah. And then you talk again about why you're a savvy candidate for the job, because that's always the role of the person who's interviewing is to sell themselves as savvy, to, demonstrate what they bring to the table, both as a professional and as a human, so that a hiring manager can decide, if they're the right fit.
Sounds great. And as you are kind of looking at different employers, whether it's kind of to stay in that field or kind of look at others, when you're speaking with them in an interview or informational interview, are there things that might be helpful to look out for or ask about?
Yeah. So most interviewers will anticipate being asked questions about the role. So, and to that end, in an interview, certainly early on in the interview process, it's a good idea to have some questions prepared about that are going to help you understand what it's like to work at this particular place. We like to use the metaphor a lot. It's a very common metaphor, actually, in the career coaching community, that job searching is like dating. And so you want to be getting to know the other person as much as you want to be helping the other person get to know you. So asking questions like, what is it like to work here? What's your favorite part of the job? Can you tell me more about X, Y, and Z thing that is true with the organization? Those are great questions to be asking early in an interview process. We often hear from people who have received a cancer diagnosis that they are very eager to find out about what benefits might be available to them sooner rather than later. They want to know what the health insurance plan is. They want to know if their oncologist is still going to be in network. So understandable, right? They want to know what kind of time off they'll have access to. Somebody who is familiar with legal protections might want to know how many people work at the organization. The FMLA, which we haven't really talked about, there need to be 50 employees. So that's something that they might want to know. Asking questions about benefits up front can actually have the effect of working against you in an interview process, because it can give the impression, not guaranteed, but it can give the hiring manager the impression that you're more interested in the benefits that come with the work than doing the work itself. And if you remember, we just talked about what's your primary goal. You want to sell yourself as savvy. You want to sell yourself as qualified. You want to sell yourself as a good fit. And spending time in the limited interview process, asking questions about the health insurance plan, that doesn't sell you the best. So if you want to find out that kind of information, go to the internet. Right? Employers Google candidates. You can Google the potential employer too. Take a look and see if, are employees tweeting about anything having to do with what it's like to work there. If somebody's concerned about the possible discrimination, maybe were discriminated against in their last job, Google to see if there's a history of discrimination lawsuits for the company. Are employees saying great things about working there on Twitter, or are they complaining? If you networked your way into the job because through somebody who already works there, maybe ask them off the record about the health insurance plan or what the vacation benefits are like, right? They'll spill that. And that way you don't have to burden the interviewing, the hiring manager with that kind of question. So it's knowing the balance of asking the right questions that are going to make you look interested and curious and eager, and waiting to ask, going to other resources for the questions that are a little bit more precarious. And of course, once you have an offer on the table, then you can feel free to ask questions about the insurance plan and the vacation and all of that. That should be included in the offer up front. So perfectly fair game if they haven't to do that beforehand.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I know we could talk about this next question for a long time, and Cancer and Careers has whole workshops dedicated to this, but could you just give us kind of some high level suggestions for things like writing your resume and cover letter?
Yeah, it's funny. When you started that framing, I knew you were going to ask about resumes and cover letters, because it really is such a big topic. What a good resume looks like for somebody who is just out of school is going to be a little bit different than somebody who has 10 years of work experience. And so on and so forth. But generally speaking, I'll speak to that point first. Generally speaking, if you are new to the job market, you want to keep your resume to one page. If you have a little bit more experience, try not to go over 2 pages. That's typically a best practice. And And it's a good idea to be refreshing your resume pretty regularly, and maybe even refining it based on the specific job that you're applying for. So, if you see in a job description that they're looking for somebody who has experience with a particular skill set, and you do have that skill, but it's not something you typically list on your resume, you might delete something and put that in for that particular job. Monica, you mentioned using Cancer and Careers Resume Review Service and that it helps you get the job that you currently have, which is something that we always love to hear. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, we think it's a great tool. Clearly, Monica thinks it's a great tool. You can go to our website, you can upload your resume, and we will pass it along to a career coach who will take a look at it and give you guidance that is specifically tailored to you, your experience, what it is that you're looking for in terms of your next job, and help you get it in the best shape possible for your job search. It's a free resource. All of our resources at Cancer and Careers are offered for free. So I definitely encourage that. We also have a publication that's called our Job Search Toolkit. You can order a hard copy to be mailed for you. Shipping is also free. You can download it in PDF version. And that has lots of examples of resumes and also cover letters, and how, because writing cover letters is an art as well. And it's a good idea in a cover letter that you don't just reiterate everything that's on your resume, but you actually use it as an opportunity to expand and use examples and share your voice in a way that's a little bit more personal to you. But again, you want it to be targeted. You don't want it to be too long. You don't want to lose the attention of who's reading. We check out our job search toolkit for suggestions on that. And the other thing that I will mention as well, Bryn, which you did not mention in your question, but LinkedIn is such an important tool these days for people who are looking for work. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is an online platform. It's kind of like Facebook in that it's a social networking situation, but it is specifically focused on professional arenas and work, all kinds. And we have a full hour-long webinar on LinkedIn that is archived on our website. It's called Building an Effective LinkedIn Profile. It was led by one of our amazing career coaches. And I really encourage people who are looking for work to check that out to make sure that they are maximizing the benefit of having a LinkedIn profile, because a lot of recruiters are finding candidates through LinkedIn these days.
That's a helpful addition. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes. And then earlier in one of your swivel examples, I loved how you said, I was in a moment to reflect on my next steps, like regarding the kind of gap. Cancer can be a cancer diagnosis can be a time to really just pause and be like, what is happening? I know for me, I was like, what is life right now? And then just kind of would love to hear what suggestions you might have for people who may want to make a change in their line of work following cancer treatment.
Yeah. So, the experience that you describe is one that I think a lot of people who are listening can probably relate to. We hear all the time from people who decide that they want to make a change in their work. And that, of course, can mean a variety of things, right? For some people, it's, I didn't want to be an accountant. My dad made me major in accounting, and now I want to do carpentry because that was always my dream, right? For some people, it's going to be, I love what I do, but I want to work fewer hours so that I can spend more time with my family and I don't feel as burnt out. For some people, it's, I want to stay in the field and just move to a different workplace because I need a fresh start. So if you're thinking about making a change, important first to define what that change means for you. And if you are currently employed, a good first step can be to look at your current job and see if there are any changes that can be made in your current job that can be satisfying either in a long-term way or in a shorter-term way while you find something else. Because it's not always practical to just drop the job that you have and walk away and hope for the best. So looking first at what's right in front of you and seeing, can you talk to your supervisor? Can you spend more time focusing on something else? and, less time focusing on another thing? Can you take on a new project and focus in a new area that's interesting and exciting for you? They have professional development funds available so that you can take a class in something that's interesting to you, right? So it's really looking in your backyard first, so to speak. And then from there, defining what meaning is, what the change is. Does finding a meaningful job for you mean going to work for a charity, right? A lot of survivors want to work in the cancer space after their diagnosis, after they're done with treatment, or even during treatment, so that they can start to give back and help. For someone else, meaning might be like our accountant who shifts to working with their hands as a carpenter instead, because that's what meaningful work is for them. So it's about, taking the time to reflect and then line up what steps are required to get there, whether it's taking a class, whether it's networking with people in the field, reaching out to people on LinkedIn to see if they'll do a quick cup of coffee or a phone call with you to talk about what it means to work in recruiting, because that's what you want to be doing, even though you've been working as a nurse for however long or whatever it might be. That's really what it is. It's understanding your process, identifying strategic steps, and then taking those steps.
Thank you, Rachel. That is very helpful. And I know that many people can feel as though they have to find like that perfect job that is filled with meaning and purpose. I know as a cancer survivor, I well, maybe that's healthcare for me, or back in a clinic with patients. And, it can kind of mean different things for people, especially after cancer, or being a caregiver of someone who's had cancer or has it. What suggestions do you have around this kind of perfect job kind of thinking?
Yeah. So there's a saying that we should always try to make sure that the perfect isn't the enemy of the good. And to me, what that means when we're thinking about looking for that next perfect job, it means understanding that sometimes you are just going to find it. That does happen. I don't want to ever be giving the impression that doesn't happen, because there's stories about it all the time. With that said, it is also possible that it's not going to happen, and that it may be beneficial, if you're looking to make a change, to think of it as a process of kind of hopping from lily pad to lily pad. That maybe your perfect job is a couple of lily pads down, but in order for you to get there, you need to first leap to something that's not totally perfect, but has pieces that are good, that can eventually get you to perfect, right? So, and I think this is particularly true when we're talking about young adults in particular, and maybe young adults who are early out of school and just starting in their careers, to have patience with the process. And I think that, it's certainly one of the lessons that I've learned in life, that the older I get, the more I appreciate the capacity for patience, and the more I work on it and try to develop it in myself, because it really can serve you. And so, look for those perfect opportunities, but also look for the opportunities where there's good, and consider all of them. And don't push away. If you get a job offer for a job that's not perfect but has good, be willing to take that, right? That's not a failure. That can be a victory as well. Just because you take a job doesn't mean you can't keep looking. People sometimes work at jobs for 2 months, and then their perfect offer comes along from the job search they were doing before they took that first job, and there they are, right? Sometimes it takes a little longer. But the idea is that we want to be strategic and practical and realistic about what's going to get us to where and what's going to get us to perfect. I also think the idea of perfect is a little bit complicated, because maybe it doesn't really exist. The more anyone who's ever gotten exactly what they wanted is probably going to follow very quickly with a story about how surprised they were to learn what that meant. And if you find yourself with getting a perfect job offer, certainly take the time to be excited about that and celebrate that. And then also recognize that work is called work for a reason. It's not always going to be wonderful. not every day is going to be perfect and feel like sunshine and roses and your dream come true. It may be the case that, in fact, more days are stressful than aren't stressful, but that could still be a very good job for you. It could still be the opportunity that's exactly where you want to be. So have a realistic sense of what it means to find the perfect job. Be prepared for that. Be prepared for dealing with those stresses along the way so that it's not a disappointing crash. To recognize that work is work.
Absolutely. I love that lily pad analogy and just jumping in a graceful way across those lily pads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we hear so much from AYAs in our program of like this just intense desire to give back or find something with meaning after. And I think it's incredible when people are able to find that in a career, but we also, talk about other ways that you can find that. And we have a lot of people, Monica being one of them, who is on our patient advisory board and, are helping us as we're developing this program, and that to them can kind of scratch that itch, if you will, of, feeling like they're able to give back or find meaning in something, even if it's not just your job. So we encourage people to kind of think more broadly about that idea as well.
It's such an important point, Bren. And thank you for making it that, meaning can come from all sorts of places. If you can find meaning in your work and that works for you, that's great. But, if you build that meaning in other ways, that is wonderful.
Right. Let's kind of building off of what you were just talking about, maybe thinking about people who aren't in the workforce yet, are in kind of this younger end of the age spectrum, or people who just, maybe are newly diagnosed and aren't necessarily thinking about work and everything that comes after. I can imagine there's probably some things to still be considering in terms of online presence is a huge deal these days, of what you're posting online or social media, or even just what you should be thinking about kind of ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something we could spend all day talking about, but such an important point. I mentioned earlier that employers do Google prospective candidates that they're looking at hiring. It's also the case that current employers will sometimes Google their candidates, the people who are working for them, rather. We hear stories about people getting a new manager at work who all of a sudden starts Googling, and they had kept their cancer out of the workplace, but then that new manager finds a posting on Facebook and suddenly it's known, right? And so that's something that can happen, is that, typically if somebody's Googling, it is for good reasons. A hiring manager likes someone, they've made a good impression, they want to learn more. A manager wants to learn more about the people who's reporting to them so that they can make conversations with them as a human being and not just as a worker. But it can lead to the discovery of information that the patient or survivor might have preferred had been kept private and out of the workplace. And so we encourage before posting that you kind of think about what you're putting up online. And this is not to say don't ever post anything about your cancer experience. We want you to get the benefit of online interactions that are important to you. We hear all kinds of stories about connections that people are able to make, and the ways that they're able to find support in moments where they otherwise felt isolated, and that's because of what social media and online platforms have been able to provide. And so I'm not in any way saying take that away, don't do it, don't talk about your cancer diagnosis at all. But it is a good idea to have a sense of what's out there for you and know how you're going to address any questions that might come up. So swiveling obviously is a great way to get out of that if something comes up. And also to first of all, consider before you post, right? It's a good idea to think about anything that you post online and know that it might still be findable 5 years from now. So is this something, how would you feel 5 years from now if someone were to come across this? How would you feel if your employer were to come across it tomorrow, or if your grandmother were to come across it? Internet is a public space, and so it's open for people to find things. So thinking about what you put up there and how that might reflect in your story, but also knowing that you can delete posts. The way that social media platforms, particularly big ones like Facebook, exist is a little bit complicated. Sometimes if you delete a post, it still exists somewhere else because somebody tagged it or somebody reshared it. So it's not always possible to get rid of something entirely, but you can certainly delete things from your timeline that are no longer relevant. And you can also post in strategic ways that help to reshape your story. So if an employer is Googling you, they're probably not going to go 5 pages deep into the Google result. They're probably going to stay on that first page. Maybe they'll go on to that second page if they get a lot of really interesting hits and they want to keep finding more. But most likely, they're going to look at what comes up at the top. So, meaningfully posting on LinkedIn articles that are relevant to the field where you work and commenting on what you think of them. Or, on your Facebook profile where you don't necessarily have to talk about work, talk about a movie that you saw that you liked, thoughts that you have on a book that you're reading, praise for friends who are doing cool things with their lives, things like that. That'll move prior posts further down your timeline. And again, people aren't likely to go digging. We have a webinar that is archived on our website that is about building an online brand and goes through various strategic ways that you can enhance your online presence. Maybe it's about starting a blog. Maybe it's about building your own website that talks about some of the work that you did and some of your accomplishments, because that will come up in very quickly in a Google search that someone does. So the idea is to be thinking about the way that you're presenting your narrative and presenting yourself and knowing that it's something that you can be in control of.
Yeah. I love that. Those are just such helpful, intentional things to be thinking about. And I appreciate you even sharing some kind of ways that can be recrafted. I could just keep talking to you both for hours, but I really appreciate what you have both shared, and I've learned so much, and I hope that others have benefited from this conversation. And Rachel, you have mentioned so many wonderful resources available through Cancer and Careers, and there's so many more that you haven't mentioned. So if someone wants to learn more or access these, could you just tell us quickly how they can do that?
Absolutely. So, our website is cancerandcareers.org. And you can also reach out to us by email at cancerandcareers@cew.org. So that's cancerandcareers@C like Charlie, E like Echo, W like Whiskey.org. And someone from our team will get back to you. You can schedule conversations about specific questions that you're having. We can point you at resources that might be best for your situation. And, we're here for you. We really look forward to being able to provide support that's going to help you in your specific circumstance.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you again, Monica, and thank you, Rachel. It's been such a helpful conversation. So thank you again.
Thank you both so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us today on The Scoop. We hope you enjoyed our conversation and learned something new. If you want to hear more of these in the future, make sure you like our page at Lurie AYA. We hope you have a happy day.